Today I want to introduce you to a man that has had a big impact on my life, and he's had an impact on many lives, and he's had tremendous influence on a nation. His name is Leo Tolstoy. I'm sure you've heard of him and heard of all of his big fat books. I didn't bring War and Peace in here, but that's the biggest one. I don't know, what is it? 900, 1200 pages, I don't know. And it's considered by some to be the greatest novel ever written, certainly a masterpiece, certainly at the very top of any great novels list. And it was C.S. Lewis's very favorite book, and he considered it a masterpiece as well. It was written as a conscription, as was Anna Karenina, which I brought in, and that meant, I mean, Anna Karenina took 6 years to write, so you're talking about, you know, it's being released by conscription in a magazine or something like that over several years, and so people are reading this novel over time, and so when you put it all together, it's a big fat thing. And of course that allows you to see characters over a several year span. It allows for major character development, and that's all beneficial too. But I want to talk about Tolstoy today and not his books. We'll do other posts on some of his novels, which I've absolutely enjoyed. I'm back in Anna Karenina again for the second time and enjoying it a lot. It's just one of those books that you read slowly over time. It's like Harold Bloom said, when you read a fat novel, you don't read it for the plot. You couldn't ever keep up with what happened next and then what happened after that. You read it for the character development, and that is definitely true of Tolstoy. He would appreciate, I think, anybody who focused on that when they read his works. So he's Russian. He was born in Russia in 1828 and lived there all during the 19th century, and was a hero at a young age, a very famous novelist, considered one of Russia's best. Dostoevsky was a contemporary of his. They were both in the realist camp, realist novelists, and although Dostoevsky did a little more psychological, had a little more psychological depth, and Tolstoy's a little more of a moralist than Dostoevsky is, but that is because of who he was as an individual. Let me tell you a little bit of an overview of his life and then talk about him just for a minute as a man. He had a lot of death and tragedy very early in his life. His mother died when he was 2. His father died when he was 9, and he was of the upper class. He was born onto the family estate into a noble family. I think he's a count. And he went to live with his aunt, who then died, his Aunt Alexandra, who then died when he was 13. So by the time he was 13, 3 of the very closest people to him had passed away, and all of his caregivers had passed away. So that made him more of a sober individual, although I do think he was an idealist by nature. And it's interesting, though, there was a soberness about all the children. One of the things it talks about here, his brother Sergei used to tell him a tale when he was young of a small green stick buried in the neighboring woods, and on it, Sergei said, was written the secret to uniting all of humanity in mutual love. Now, when I read that, it made a big impression on me about Tolstoy and who he was and where he lived and the people that were around him and the kinds of things that he thought about. He was deep. He was very, very deep, and when you read Tolstoy, you can expect to go deep, which, of course, I love. Sometimes you got to come up for air, read him slowly, and balance him with some fun stuff on either side. But he will stretch you and push you, and it's fascinating to me. You know, we're so wrapped up in the 21st century and the age of knowledge and faster and better and bigger. And when he said that his brother, when I started to read, his brother said there was this magical stick buried in the woods, of course my mind conjured up thoughts of a spring where you can live forever, or untold riches were there, or you could have anything that you wished for. Because that's the world that I live in, and unfortunately I'm probably still too worldly that those were some of the thoughts that came to me. But it was the secret to uniting all of humanity in mutual love. Well, that's a very mature, especially spiritually mature thing for little boys to talk about. And I think it says a lot about who Tolstoy was and who he became, that those were the kinds of things that he and his siblings talked about, because uniting humanity in brotherly love, bringing peace to the world, educating the poor, taking care of the peasants, all of those were themes throughout his life that he returned to again and again and again. And I'll touch on a couple things that he did in his life that were really kind of crazy, kind of not entirely, I wouldn't say unprecedented, but very rare. He was a rare person. It's interesting, in the preface to his journal, which is another work I highly recommend, in the preface to the original 1917 that I was reading, the translator was talking all about how you cannot understand the story of Russia and the communist revolution and what happened in 1917 and beyond unless you understood Tolstoy. She said that he was like the father of the nation, and his children watched him and wanted to follow him and his example, and that you can't really understand the history of Tolstoy without the history of Russia, and vice versa, that they were too interconnected. I find that very fascinating, and there's so much truth in that from what I know about Russian history and Russian communist history especially, and what I know of Tolstoy, and of course I'm still on that journey to learn what I can. So he's very attracted to extremes. Always was an extremist because he wanted truth. He wanted internal peace. It's a theme in virtually every one of his writings. How do we find peace? How do we be at peace with ourselves? How do we like ourselves? How do we discover ourselves? How do we be at peace with God and the world? And so he experimented, and he experienced the extremes of life, and that played into the depth of his novels and into his understanding of human nature, which his books are very rich with. They're a very good tutelage in that. So when he's 13, 14, 15, he forces himself to go through all these grueling physical exercises, even to the point of self-flagellation, which is crazy to me. And he would go through these bouts where he would force himself to be extremely rigid and in all his behavior, and very devout. I mean, two major extremes. And then he would go to the other extreme of extreme self-indulgence and laziness. He couldn't figure out how to find the middle ground. Then as he hit 17, 18, 19, and he's off at college, and this really reminds me of Benjamin Franklin, which, to read their journals together, to read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography and Tolstoy's journal might really be a great experience. But he starts this, it explains it here: physical exercise, exhaustive study, and painstaking documentation of his moral development in his diary. It was a rigorous program of self-betterment, much like Benjamin Franklin tried to do. I think Benjamin Franklin was more balanced and not as extreme, but it's this longing to be better and to grow and to improve himself that is so indicative of Tolstoy all his life. So he continues on this path. He's educating himself, and then he hits about 20, and he decides that his society is unjust. He's been educating himself, he's been thinking, he's been pondering, and he looks around and he sees how the peasants live, and he decides he's going to better the circumstances of the peasants. And that also is a lifelong theme. And especially his culminating work, his end work, maybe not, people wouldn't call his culminating work, but his last work, Resurrection, that was the last novel that he wrote, really hits heavy on this theme, and he's really trying to give Russia the answers for moving forward as a society and bettering the condition of all mankind. So he goes home and he dedicates himself to bettering the life of the peasants. He starts educational programs. He tries to assist them in their labors and find means for their improvement. But at the same time, he also indulges in a very decadent life. He drinks. He's with different women. And then he'll feel guilty for it and try to turn around. It's fascinating. And there's two characters especially in his works that if you want to understand Tolstoy as a man and kind of how he saw himself and what he was about, Levin and Anna Karenina is really probably the character that's the very most like him in so many ways. His attitude, his self-doubt, his desire to be close to the land and better the situation of the peasants and mankind, his constant questioning of his motivations and of his self, his seeking for others, just all of it, that's who he is. And is it what's his name again? Nekhlyadov in Resurrection, his last work, is much like Tolstoy as well. So at age 23, he begins an autobiographical novel called Childhood, and it hits Russia by storm. At age 24, it's published, and he's already seen as a major author, and he's already receiving accolades from very, very high up in the Russian aristocracy. He follows that up with Boyhood and later writes Youth, and then he goes on at 31 to write Family Happiness. Family is a major Tolstoy theme as well. When you're reading his works, always look for the theme of family because he has a lot to say. He wanted an ideal family, and one of the great heartbreaks of his life was not only that his family that he grew up in, there were so many deaths and things. When his one brother, Nikolai, died, he fell into a major depression. Later on, when he was writing Anna Karenina and two of his children died, and his aunt that raised him, his favorite aunt, Tatiana, he just about couldn't pull out of that depression. And then he wanted a perfect family. I found out through my research that he wrote a primer to educate his children with. He wanted to be very involved as a father. He wanted an ideal relationship with Sophia, but that didn't come into play, and their relationship actually kind of got worse over time as he became kind of more extreme in his religious views. They became more ostracized from each other, and I'll tell you about those last death scenes in just a minute. But it's sad. So he didn't have the ideal family that he longed for, but he believed, I think, that maybe it could be. It was a lifelong quest for him that he didn't realize, and that was, and in that sense, that's what Levin wants too. And Levin kind of gets what Tolstoy didn't get. So anyway, at age 34, he doesn't marry till 34, but at age 34, after kind of some reluctance, and he couldn't decide, and he's like Levin also in his courtship with Sophia. There are a lot of similarities there as well, that he loved a couple different daughters, and this family wanted to marry, and this family wasn't sure if he wanted to marry her, was really doubting himself, finally did. And one of the extreme measures that's just typical of him, he made Sophia read his journals from when he was living this really decadent lifestyle. He felt like full disclosure was necessary in order for his conscience to be clear. And I don't know if that was good or bad or right or wrong, but that's who he was. He really felt that he had to always be straightforward and forthcoming and very transparent and honest. And so at 35, he begins War and Peace, his what everyone considers to be his best work. That's written over a period of 6 years. Actually, Anna Karenina wasn't over 3 years. It was only 3 or 4 years. War and Peace was over 6 years, and was finally put together in one volume. And Crime and Punishment's being written right about the same time as well, so you can kind of know what else is going on literary-wise in Russia. These 3 deaths happened. He was going to write a book about Peter the Great, but he wasn't interested in it. He decided he wanted to give it up. And he heard about, or he was I don't think he saw the death actually happen, but he saw the body laid out of a woman who had been a mistress to a man that he knew, and she had killed herself at the train, throwing herself in front of the train, like the end of Anna Karenina. And he saw the body laid out at the station. And that and a few other actual real events led him to begin Anna Karenina. But by the time he was done writing it, he was sick of it. He rewrote it, rewrote it, rewrote it. He was very meticulous with himself. He was very demanding of himself. And he did the same thing with Resurrection, and not quite to that extreme, but he forced himself to keep rewriting it until and even then he was sick of it and he wanted to be done with it. At the end of Anna Karenina, you really get a glimpse into where Tolstoy's at in his, at 50. It's really kind of a midlife crisis. He has had all these deaths happen. He's been writing about the downfall of Anna Karenina, and he's at a spiritual crisis. And the end of Anna Karenina kind of brings some of those ideas to the surface, and he finally confesses to his wife that he doesn't know if he's capable of continuing to live with the spiritual and philosophical questions that absorb him. He doesn't have the answers to the most important questions of life, and he can't handle that he doesn't have the answers, and he doesn't know how to go on. So he goes on this spiritual quest. And he studies all these world religions, and he studies all of these philosophies, especially of the West. He writes in 82, so now he's 54, he writes a confession, an essay on religion and the meaning of life, and it's banned in Russia. So here he is, this icon. He's been writing for 30 years at this point. He's world famous, but he's also just this father figure icon in Russia, and he writes a confession and it's banned. He goes on to write another work that's so controversial and scandalous that it can't even be published. And then at 63, he signs over his property to his family and gives up the rights to all his publications and gives all the land to the peasants. And that is what's going on in Resurrection. That's the inner struggle that the main character is having there. And it's interesting and important to know that as he writes about Nekhludoff actually doing that in Resurrection, he had already done it in real life. So that's really interesting to know. His family was angered over it, and for the last 20 years of his life, his relationships were strained. They were good with some of his children, and in some ways they were kind of good with his wife, but she was very angry. He kind of lived like, I mean, at one point he just kind of took off. He lived kind of like a monk, and he wanted spiritual perfection. He wanted he wanted people to be good and do what was right and listen to their consciences and all this kind of thing. And he was so idealistic, his wife didn't know how to deal with him, so it was difficult. At the end of his life, there was a huge battle in the family over his will, and at 82, he couldn't handle it anymore at home. So he left home with his daughter and I think his attorney. They got on a train and he didn't even make it. He broke down at one of the stations. I think it was Astapovo. They took him to the station master's house, and his wife followed him and tried to see him, and he wouldn't let her in. And he died alone in the station house. His will, all family up in arms about his will, struggling to know kind of who he was, what he was about. But I don't want to paint a picture of a wacko, okay? I don't want you to get the idea that he was just out there. He really was an extremist, but he was an idealist, and he wanted people to be better, and he wanted to live true to himself. And I think some of what he was trying to do and be his family, and especially his wife, does not understand. But he's a fascinating individual. His life is very interconnected with the history of Russia, as I mentioned before. And you could continue to read about him the rest of your life and probably not figure it all out. But his books are amazing. The Death of Ivan Ilyich is a short story if you want to start somewhere. Also, I highly recommend his journal. He's got a few shorter works that you could try out, and then you could read some of his bigger works in pieces. But that's a little bit about Leo Tolstoy. I'm sorry we went long, but he's I don't know. He's incredible. He's an inspiration to me. He changed the lives of many individuals, had a huge impact on Suzuki and others, so he's worth knowing about. Learn about him, learn about the author every time you read. Always suggest that. If this was beneficial for you, please pass it on to a friend. Like us if you like us, and we'll see you next time.